Origin of the Species, a critical analysis of Darwin's basic theory. There are strong and weak points to the theory. So let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. The full title of Darwin's 1859 book is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. At that time in Europe, book titles were intended to give a summary of the contents. Darwin was not the first to claim that all modern species originated from a common ancestor, but he was the first to publish a believable way it could have happened without supernatural intervention. He offered a three-step process for the development of new species. First, variation occurs randomly. That is, changes from parent to offspring are without pattern or reason. Some changes will improve chances for survival in the environment, some will be neutral, and some will reduce survival chances. Second, competition in the environment determines which variations survive to reproduce. The ones that survive are deemed fittest. Last, the surviving variation becomes the basis for the next round of variation, and the process starts all over again. If this is correct, then over time you can see that species would gradually improve until there was a new, more advanced species altogether. In summary, random changes filtered by natural processes lead to improved species. Again, the reason this theory was so important was that it was the first rational explanation for how the great variety and complexity of life could get here without the direct intervention of God. The theory does have some problems, however, some of which are Darwin's word choices. He titled the book Origin of Species, but the theory does not deal with origins, only variations once the first species exists. The only explanation Darwin ever offered for origin was a warm pool of water. Another difficulty is Darwin's reference to favored races. Darwin believed that races naturally compete for survival, and that one race will inevitably dominate at the expense of others, and that his theory applies equally to humans as to any other animal. And guess which race he thought was superior? His own. He expressed compassion for other races, but assumed that they would eventually die out in the struggle for life. Three other words make the theory difficult to work with because of their vague definitions. They are species, selection, and variation. Let's look at these in more detail, beginning with variation.
Variation can be of two types. Mutation causes something new to be produced. A gene is different from what was there before. Today we know this requires a permanent change in the DNA pool, the coded language that dictates each organism's form. This is also known as macroevolution. This is a misleading term because it implies it is only a bigger version of microevolution, which it isn't. The other type of variation is adaptation. It occurs when something already present simply changes in availability or proportion. The same genes are still involved. This could be like green eyes occurring in an offspring when neither parent had green eyes. The DNA was there in the parents. It just didn't have the right mix to show up in the parents. The principle was demonstrated by Gregor Mendel in his famous 1865 study of peas, 6 years after Darwin's book. I hope you can see that macroevolution is not simply another degree of macroevolution. Mutations are accidents. They were not understood until the DNA code was cracked, 90 years after Darwin's publication. DNA sometimes mutates, resulting in something different from either parent. If the organism survives and is still fertile, it is capable of passing this genome to its offspring. Mutation occurs when something in the DNA code is changed, and a different signal is given for construction of a single molecule. DNA is a written language, and like any language, the change of a single letter can change meaning. Take, for example, the English alphabet and just a few letters that have specific meaning, H-A-T. By changing one letter, the meaning is changed. For this three-letter arrangement, 12 of the 26 letters that could be placed at the beginning of the word would still have meaning. Plus, leaving off the first letter altogether still yields a meaning. About half of the letters in the alphabet produce words with meaning when matched with the last two. If we increase complexity slightly to a 6-letter word, there are only 4 letters that can be substituted for the first and still make sense. the odds of randomly picking one that works now drops to less than 1 in 8. If we put the word into a 50-character sentence, there is no other letter that can be substituted anywhere and still have meaning. The principle is just as true for DNA. The more complex the DNA message, the less likely it is that an accident will have meaning, much less an improvement. The simplest DNA messages have 50 characters, just like this sentence. The more complex ones have 500. The chances of a DNA message having a chance mutation that is useful in an organism is incredibly small. Mutations are accidents. The more complex the DNA message is, the less likely it is that an accident will be viable at all, much less an improvement. Let's take, for example, the well-documented mutations among humans. A quick search of the web can uncover this many human mutations that start with the letter A alone. They are all harmful. More than 5,000 distinct diseases have been ascribed to mutations that result in deficiencies of critical enzymes. Note that this quote makes mutations synonymous with disease and deficiency. As we would expect, all documented mutations in humans are the result of something that once worked either no longer working, such as blindness, or something in the wrong place, such as an extra finger or toe. Mutations that result in new information, useful or otherwise, in any organism are extremely rare, if they can be verified at all. Remember that when Darwin wrote Origin of the Species, the term species was not clearly defined, and the problem has not been corrected. Consider, for instance, these 3 animals. They are labeled as 3 different species, primarily because they inhabit 3 different parts of the world. But without the labels, most observers would be hard-pressed to tell the difference. Whereas these animals are all considered to be of the same species, regardless of the vast differences, because we know they originated from the same gene pool. Obviously, vast differences can occur within the same gene pool through artificial selection. Can one species evolve to another? It depends not only upon our definition of evolution, but also on what we mean by species. And as for selection, selection is not exactly what happens in nature. The best are not favored. Instead, the poorest are disfavored. Consider, for example, an antelope. It could be food for a cheetah. If there is one antelope and the cheetah catches it, then the lineage is over. No more reproduction. But if there are 10 antelope, which one is going to get stopped from reproducing? The slowest one. But 9 remaining antelope are unlikely to survive either. For this principle of survival to work, there must be many antelope. In fact, animals are often put on an endangered species list if their numbers drop below 1,000 reproducing adults. This is because limited gene pools put them at risk of extinction from disease, changing environments, or mutation. The smaller the gene pool, the less variety for survival when conditions change. I say reproducing adults because among antelopes, for instance, only about 20% survive to reproduce. Don't feel too sorry for the antelopes, however. A similar percentage also is true for the cheetahs. If large numbers must survive, then we are not talking about natural selection of superior animals. We are talking about natural elimination of the maimed, blind, lame, and unlucky. This process cannot improve the species any more than final inspection at a car manufacturing plant will create a new model. It merely preserves the good qualities it already has. Selection, by contrast, would be to intentionally pick just a few with specific desired traits and allow only them to breed, eliminating all other variation. This cannot be successful in the wild because of the dangerously limited gene pool. With domestic animals, we do it all the time, and it is a much faster and more permanent way to bring about change than elimination in the wild. We can see the artificial selection process among dogs. Meet Belle. Belle is much loved by her owners, though she is your basic dog, Canis mutus. If dogs of all breeds are left to interbreed at will, dogs very similar to Belle always result. Short yellow-brown hair, medium height, brown eyes. Australia's dingoes is a good example of how this has occurred when domesticated dogs are allowed to return to the wild. Suppose we start with a dog like Belle and decide to produce a hunting dog like Weimaraner. Belle is full of variety, like this jar of jelly beans. If we select for only orange jelly beans, eating or discarding all the rest, we eventually have only orange jelly beans. Just let Belle breed with whatever jumps over the fence, and the puppies will have variety. Then you might consider eye color and select the yellowest. You could consider hair color and select the grayest. Eventually, after many generations, you will have something like a Weimaraner, and every puppy will have the same features because the gene pool has been restricted like the jelly beans. Of course, Weimaraners are more sophisticated than just coloration, but the principle is there. Selective breeding creates nothing. It merely eliminates options that were already there until variation from the desired form can no longer occur. You couldn't get Belle from a Weimaraner, but you could get something close to a Weimaraner from Belle. The reverse is not true because the other gene options have all been eliminated. A good example of variation in the wild can be found in the Pacific Ocean in the Galapagos Islands, on the equator near South America. Here we find Darwin's finches. These birds differ slightly but distinctly, originating from different islands, and many are called by different species names. Most feed on seeds that grow on their island. It has been observed that during times of drought, that is cool La Nina years, seeds with thin hulls dry out and don't reproduce. Harder hulled seeds become more common. As a result, birds with thin beaks have a harder time getting through the hulls, and those with thicker, stronger beaks multiply. But guess what happens when rains return during warm La Nina years? Hulls get thinner, and beaks get smaller again. When food is plentiful or more likely to fall into tiny crevices, a big, heavy bill becomes a liability. No permanent change has taken place. It is just a shifting back and forth among a few genes already present. Let's consider what actually happens when a population shifts in some characteristic as Darwin's finches do. A bird gets half of its genes from the male parent and half from the female. For the sake of simple illustration, let us suppose that there is one large beak protein and one small beak protein that a gene might produce, and that these are all that are involved in determining beak size. If the bird gets one large beak gene from one parent and one small beak gene from the other, the bird in our illustration gets a medium-sized beak. If it gets two large beak genes, it has large beak. If it gets two small beak genes, it gets a small beak. Now let each bird breed with a bird like itself and have 4 offspring. What will they look like? Large-billed birds will have large-billed offspring, and small-billed birds will have small-billed offspring. We know mathematically, and from the work Bendel did, that the medium-billed birds can be expected to leave half medium-bill, a quarter large-bill offspring, and a quarter small-bill offspring. There's no more room on the chart. So, next generation, only half of the birds can breed. This is like the limitation in nature on food supply. If again only thick-hulled seeds are available, the large-billed birds keep the advantage. So, let's say 4 out of the 5 have offspring. That leaves 1 medium bill to breed and 1 small bill to breed. Since they are crowded, we'll let each have 2 offspring. What will that look like? Large-bill birds breeding with large-bill birds will have all large-bill offspring, and small bills will yield small bills. Which medium-bill offsprings are most likely to survive? For illustration, let's assume 1 medium bill and 1 large bill survive. Seed hulls are still tough, so let's assume half the large-billed birds survive to bear 2 offspring each. We only have 2 spaces left, so which bird is most likely to have successful offspring during tough old times? This time let's assume the medium-billed bird has 2 medium-bill offspring. Consider how the population of birds has changed in just 3 generations of dry season. The population has shifted from equal numbers to no small bills and mostly large bills. The average bill size has greatly enlarged, but what has actually changed in the gene pool? We started out with small bill genes and we now have small bill genes. We started with large-billed genes, and we now have large-billed genes. The only change is proportion. This microevolution cannot create permanent or substantial change. Suppose now the wind changes, the rains return, and the seeds again have thin hulls. In the next breeding cycle, the smaller-billed birds have the advantage, and the whole thing reverses. The proportions would be as described earlier. Large-billed birds could fill the rest of the space not taken by the advantaged. This is exactly what happens in the Galapagos Islands every La Niña cycle. The population begins to shift back towards smaller bills in only one breeding cycle again. We started with small-billed genes and large-billed genes, and we finish with small and large-billed genes. The only change is proportion. The only permanent change would be if conditions were so extreme for so long that one gene was totally eliminated, an extremely unlikely case. Then flexibility is lost, and the organisms are less capable of surviving any change at all. So, yes, environment affects for survival and reproduction, but several points in Darwin's model may need revision. There are trials that filter out which organisms survive, but variation does not lead to new information. Both mutation and adaptation occur in nature, but favorable adaptations increase while mutations are more likely to fail and be filtered out. So when mutations occur, they only threaten or weaken the gene pool. Struggles in the environment filter out the dysfunctional mutations. Over generations, the organism kind is kept healthy without improvement, but also without loss. Instead of natural selection bringing about origin of species, it brings about preservation of kinds on a larger scale. And instead of struggle for life favoring races, it preserves healthy varieties. In summary, change from one species to another is a misleading basis for evaluating evolution because it may not identify permanent change. Natural selection does not necessarily remove neutral traits. It may simply reduce their frequency during times that they are less useful. Mutation is harmful. Natural selection helps keep it in check. Adaptation is a way of preserving an organism's kind, not a mean for changing it to something else. If macroevolution has taken place, resulting in a variety of organisms we see on Earth, a better model than Darwin's must be developed to explain it. Yet, as we have seen, Darwin's model will be fiercely defended, revised, and propped up until a better, non-purposive, materialistic model is developed. But as long as the shortfalls of Darwin's model are denied, a better model cannot be advanced. So, why the fierce defense of an inadequate model stifling the advance of science? Because all materialists fear that no other rational explanation can be found than an all-powerful, non-material, and purposeful mind, which can only be called God. Regardless of the evidence, their a priori religious convictions say God must not be allowed as an answer. But ask the beasts and let them teach you, or the birds of the sky and let them tell you, or speak to the earth and let it teach you, or let the fish of the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind. There are actually 3 Hebrew words here that could be translated as breath. The first is like physically breathing breath. The second implies sustaining life, breathing in and out day after day. The third, ruach, is many times translated spirit. It's like the breath you take when you breathe in the smell of coffee percolating or bacon sizzling in a pan. It's like, oh yeah. It's becoming aware of something that enlivens you. It includes our awareness of God himself. So here's my personal translation of the verse. In his hands is the life breath of every creature that he sustains and the awareness of all mankind.